Oh, it had to earn it. I'm really. Yes. I'm Bradley Miller. I work with digital soil mapping. So of course I try to provide soil maps that you all may want to use for your research, but also interestingly, we're using AI a lot in trying to predict where soil patterns are. So in many ways, there's convergence here, just different data sets, but similar technology.
Thank you. And actually, I did about 3 years. Go ahead, talk to me about something else.
I'm Lauren Merrick, and I am at the plant station and in research out there, and my crops are sunflower and flax and grass stuff. And just sort of thinking about what are new ways that we can deal with items.
Okay, thank you. And then the third one, you go introduction. The reason I'm giving out is that we actually started the PI, the paper reading challenge. Anybody who actually finished that reading, because the whole paper is 6 pages. Did you finish it? Almost? Not that?
No, not far enough.
It is not far enough.
Not
okay.
far.
So my group got the earlier access to the paper. So far I have 3, maybe some people forgot to sign up. I know. Okay. The reason I do that because after the paper was published, I sent that to 82 scientists, across the different states, and I got very positive feedback. That's why instead of arranging a half an hour or partial seminar for Karlene, we arranged a 4-hour seminar for her. Because on myself, it's difficult to keep up, right? All this we're learning, right? We're learning from Dr. Allison's pioneering work many years ago, right? And then we try to catch up. But learning does not if it's not dedicated time. But I understand everybody have a busy schedule, right? 20 students in the audience, some of them they know I speak highly of you. If you finish, email me, you'll get a card. This card is a $15 an hour of bread, big card. I bought this morning. I'm calculating how many you will finish that task. It purposely give you 2 weeks to finish reading, right? Reading of 52 pages, ignore the references. Because when I send the email to all the scientist colleagues, they'll say, oh, great, it's timely, but I know that they will come. They will ask the students, right? So reading is tough, because especially if you see that sign up, we have students spend 10 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours just to finish that reading, right? For their dedication, so that's why I give the $15 card, and then their 3 faculty showed up. They deserve that, the card encouragement too. Okay, I still got a large stack of cards. This card is paid out of kit, but actually not out of pocket because this is actually a book series of advances of Browning with this paper published. I got some small portion of awareness, right? We should really thank Karlene for the one who finished the class, so I can get legal from that. Thank you, Karlene. Let's put a lot on fire. Students, you finish tomorrow, tonight, this weekend, email me, you'll get a copy. I really want to help you learn too, like the learning on the group. So Karlene grew up on a farm near Sutherland, population size of 600.
Yep.
Small town in Iowa. And her interest in breeding genetics started. He earned her bachelor's degree in animal science, then master's degree from plant science in Missouri State University. Started with IDG program 2021. She actually published 1 paper out of her master's study, journal publication in Fruit Research, Grape Wine Research. And then when we got this request, this advanced agronomy in the request for me, I was debating, I was thinking I might be coupled with AI expert, but I eventually identified Karlene to be the one that finished that manuscript. It took lots of time to finish that manuscript, right? And then Karlene has been active at Iowa State, IT chair for the Raymond F. Baker Plant Breeding Symposium, served as a Karlene graduate student club trader during 2023, member of planning committee for the interdisciplinary biology science symposium last year. And then she also presented her research at NABP, PAG, maize genetic meeting, corn breeding research meeting, and Raymond F. Baker Plant Breeding Symposium. In her free time, Karlene enjoys reading, sewing, playing board games with friends. I'm reading actually the Weber Words announcement, in case you didn't read that before. Karlene is going to have some presentation. We want everybody to stay. The unique feature of Plant Breeding Seminar is that we have extended discussions, so that helps you learn. We strongly encourage any students, you are new to any areas, to ask questions. Everybody, you actually are expert. You will also participate in discussion, exchange, and let's welcome Karlene.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for the introduction. As the title suggests, today I'll be talking to you about artificial intelligence and how it's been used for crop improvement. Okay, there we go. And so I thought the best place to start with this was obviously at the beginning. AI as a term was coined way back in 1956 at a summer workshop called the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. This ended up serving as kind of a think tank for some of the early AI methods that were developed during this period. Some other information I think is good, especially for us grad students who don't have to deal with computers the size of rooms anymore, is the state of computing during this period. We all know as Iowa State students and employees that the first computer was developed in 1939 here at ISU. It was prototyped during that year and then finished in 1942. And during the same year that AI was coined, in fact, the first computer with a hard drive, which is shown in the figure, was also developed. And the first modern computer with a consumer user interface, in fact, wasn't developed until 1968. And so keeping some of those dates in mind as we go through some of these early AI methods is a good thing to do. Also, to kind of all bring us onto the same page and understand what kind of my definition of AI, which is largely influenced by many other people's definition of AI, is kind of two working definitions. The first is a little more straightforward, being that AI is just a mechanized agent that can utilize inputs to perform an action. This sounds really general, and that's because AI, as we'll see, is actually a really general field. AI, the second definition I like to use is that AI is concerned with the process of designing computers that can think and act humanly and rationally. And so, as I mentioned, AI has changed a lot since its inception, and that's part of the reason why these definitions need to be so general. AI has went through several seasons, as they're called, namely AI summers, in which interest and research has risen, and AI winters, in which research and interest has fallen dramatically. We've had two previous AI summers and two previous winters, and we're currently in the era of the third AI summer. Going into some of those eras specifically, they're all defined by some key methods and events that have really characterized them. The first summer lasted from about 1948 with some of the pre-AI work, so to speak, until the mid-1960s. This era was defined by some early work both on very early neural networks and another subtype of AI called symbolic AI. Early neural networks we'll cover first. These were heavily inspired by early neuroscience. An example of the very first neural network, which was called the perceptron, is shown on the right. And it was mathematically, conceptually developed in 1943 and then computationally implemented in 1957. But how the perceptron worked is it would have a number of inputs. In this example, we have X1, X2, and X3, and also three corresponding weights, W1, W2, and W3. These inputs and their weights are summed to create our parameter Z, and then Z is transformed with a step function in order to generate our output. This was the extent of the very first neural network, and it also served as the starting point for many modern neural networks. And now I also mentioned this other subfield of AI called symbolic AI. And just so we kind of understand what the layout of the whole field of AI and its subfields are, is we have what we kind of modernly think of as AI being learning types of AI. So this includes things like machine learning and neural networks, also some more specific fields such as computer vision and natural language processing. These are all systems that update themselves based on the data. In contrast, we have our kind of earlier subfield of AI called symbolic AI, which instead is focused on the development of logic and logic rules, which are all based on knowledge that humans already have. And so some more differences between these two fields are that symbolic AI is associated with symbols and symbolic representations. And also that means is some common formulas that we interact probably on a fairly regular basis. We can denote the intersection of A and B as A plus B using this type of symbolic representation. Another key difference is that because it uses symbols, it also relies on logical rules for its reasoning. The statement, if A and not B, then C, can similarly be represented through these symbols. And this is a pretty human understandable interface. It really closely mimics natural language. And so the interpretability remains high since the system is reasoning in a format that humans are familiar with. Subsymbolic or learning AI, by contrast, deals exclusively with numbers and systems of equations. And because of that, their interpretability can remain moderate to low depending on the methods. So just to give an example of one specific type of symbolic AI, which is called inductive logic programming, this kind of gives us a better idea of the theory behind some of these early symbolic systems. Say we have a data set, we have knowledge of a few plants. We have replicates A through D. We have some color information, whether they're green or brown plants, also whether they're tall or short, and whether their condition is diseased or healthy. In an inductive logic programming system, we might want to answer the question, based on this information, based on this knowledge, how can we predict if a plant is healthy? And first we have to define the knowledge that we have based on this data set. And so the knowledge we have is A is green, D is green, A is tall, C is tall, and A is healthy. And I have an asterisk here because inductive logic programming assumes something called closed world assumptions. This just means if information is not provided in the knowledge base, it's assumed to be false. So the absence of B is green from the knowledge base implies that green is not, or B is not green. And so that's a key hallmark of inductive logic programming. And inductive logic programming is also focused on synthesizing the rules to make those predictions. So some really simple possible rules that we have are if X is green, then X is healthy. We know that this violates some of the knowledge that we have because replicate D is green, but replicate D is not healthy. Similarly, we could try another simple rule for tall. If X is tall, then X is healthy. We know that's also violated by replicate C. And so in this really simple example, it's kind of obvious that we could combine these two rules to create a rule that's if X is green and X is healthy, and X is tall, then X is healthy. And inductive logic programming seems really simple, but this was a large component of early AI, just generating these logical rules. And in early AI, they were convinced that they could use this type of approach to approximate all human knowledge to create a system that could achieve general artificial intelligence, which is also sometimes abbreviated as AGI. And so the Winter 1 was kicked off by the growing obviousness that tasks such as AGI and machine translation were in fact far off prospects. A lot of funding was cut to these programs, and so there was a big dip in interest and research. During this first winter, the goals of AI researchers really shifted from these really general tasks to highly specialized and highly specific tasks that could potentially be solved with this type of symbolic AI. Symbolic AI still remained to be the focus during this period because of continued limited computational capacity. And these factors really set the stage for the rise of another type of symbolic AI called expert system during the second AI summer. The second summer ranged from the years of about the late 1970s to the mid 1980s, and it was defined by this expert system. Expert systems were just a more sophisticated take on symbolic AI and tried to achieve the goal of mimicking human expert reasoning. They did this by taking a human expert and having them design a set of knowledge in a process called knowledge engineering to populate the knowledge base of this expert system. Human expert users who were non-experts could then interface with this expert system and interact with the knowledge base through an inference engine. Some of the advantages of expert systems were that they were highly interpretable because of their reliance on symbolic reasoning. However, as you might notice, all the information that the system uses has to be defined in the knowledge base. And so that creates a knowledge acquisition bottleneck. Any problem that the system attempts to solve must be hard-coded via rules and knowledge into this system. That also results in a system that's really rigid. And so expert systems were actually one example of early AI that was applied pretty successfully to a crop improvement task. They were developed for crop management systems, and because of their narrow scope, they were actually pretty successful. I've included two examples, one being PALM, which is an apple orchard pest management system that was developed in the mid-1980s, and also COMAX, which was a cotton management system. And that was unique because it combined its expert system with a crop simulation model in order to generate its management recommendations. The second winter was initiated with kind of the failure of the expert system to scale to larger problems. It was also defined by some problems in terms of the continued lack of probabilistic reasoning in AI systems, and also the lack of scalability from the knowledge acquisition and representation bottleneck. The second AI winter extended from the late 1980s until the early 2010s. That endpoint was a little bit disputed because despite low public interest during this period, some really high quality research was being performed, and there were a number of machine learning approaches that were developed that are still used today. And so I'm starting to mention machine learning, and it's good in this discussion to kind of outline some of the differences and lack of differences between machine learning and statistics. And so when I'm saying learning or machine learning, I'm just talking about the process of improving performance based on provided data. And so machine learning and statistics and artificial intelligence and statistics have a lot of overlap, and kind of all of those methods that fall into both of those categories are termed something called statistical learning. And this constitutes a pretty large number of machine learning approaches. However, there are some approaches that obviously fill into the ends of this little continuum. And so defining what the differences are between some of those methods is also important. The main differences is what these two fields prioritize. Statistics prioritizes inference, and it's also concerned with maximizing prediction accuracy, but not at the cost of inference capability. Whereas machine learning is almost solely focused on increasing prediction accuracies, and many times it is at the cost of inference capabilities. So just to get an idea of where some of the methods that we will be talking about fall on this continuum, we've already covered expert systems up on the top right, and inductive logic programming, which are both examples of solely artificial intelligence methods. Next, we'll be covering some statistical learning methods, including decision trees, random forests, and support vector machines. And we'll round out the presentation with a discussion of neural networks, which are a type of machine learning and AI that doesn't fall into statistical learning. So the three methods that I mentioned, decision tree learning, random forests, and support vector machines, were all developed in the second AI winter, or developed or popularized in the second AI winter. Decision tree learning is essentially the learning of decision rules in a tree-like structure. In this example, our rules are shown in the yellow, And we're using rules such as if the X input is less than 10, you apply subsequent different rules based on if it's true or if it's false. And you apply those different rules until you reach a classification or a regression. Random forests are based in decision tree learning. They utilize a collection of decision trees in order to make a prediction, each make a prediction, which is then averaged or majority voted. In this example, we are using the same input for each of these 4 decision trees. Each decision tree generates either class A, B, or C. Because there's 2 instances of class A, majority voting determines class A is the classification for this random forest. Support vector machines are a little bit different. They use something called hyperplane selection. And all hyperplane selection is the identification of a line that maximizes the margin between 2 categories. So in this example, we have a blue category and a red category, and this is the boundary line that maximizes the area in between the dotted and solid line, or the margin. And so those 3 machine learning approaches all belonged to the second AI winter. As we transitioned into the 3rd AI summer, which is currently ongoing, we see a return to the neural networks which were initially developed in the 1940s and 50s. And so all neural networks are a class of machine learning that shares some core architectural components. Among those components are things like learned parameters. These are the values that are updated during the training process in order to achieve greater prediction accuracies. And there's also components called hyperparameters, which are parameters that are fixed during a training set. And oftentimes the human user has to define them. So the first thing we're going to cover is the computational unit of a neural network. And you might recognize this. This is actually the perceptron from the 1940s and 50s. The perceptron is the basis of the most simple type of computational unit. Oftentimes, the computational unit is just called a node, and it's depicted in this circle structure. And so the perceptron neural network would be considered to be a network that just has one single node. There are other variants of computational units that exist in many other types of AI or many other types of neural networks. However, this is kind of the default unless something else is specified. Next, we're going to cover the depth of units and layers. Neural networks can have any number of layers. The simplest type of neural network, or the second simplest type of neural network, has just an input layer, an output layer in the gray, and hidden layer here shown either in the green or the purple. The shallow neural network only has one hidden layer, and so that's what classifies it as a shallow network. In order to be classified as a deep neural network, it must have at least 3 or more hidden layers, such as shown in the purple on the right. Most modern neural networks are all types of deep neural networks, also sometimes referred to as deep learning. And so these methods are the most common in terms of depth. So we've covered layers and what these circle structures are. Next, in this kind of circle and line figure, we need to define what the lines are. And all that is the connections between the nodes, providing input and output directions for the numbers coming out of these units. The first type is feed forward, here shown in the blue. Feed forward connections transmit the information in only the input to output direction. And so, for example, the outputs of the nodes in the first hidden layer are used as the inputs for the nodes in the second hidden layer. A special type of feed-forward connection is a skip connection, here shown in the dark blue. And in this instance, it's just a feed-forward connection that is between non-adjacent layers in the network. And so information is still flowing in the input to output direction. Another type is intralayer connections, shown connecting nodes within a layer. These types of connections often flow in both directions. So it flows outputs from the nodes on the left to the nodes on the right and vice versa. Feedback connections, our fourth type, feeds information in the opposite direction. So it processes outputs from the output to input direction. In this example, a node in the second hidden layer has its output used as input for a node in the second hidden layer, or the first hidden layer. The final type of connection is the self connection. And all this is feeding output from one node back as input to that very same node. We'll look at a specific type of neural network called recurrent neural networks that use self connections here in a little bit. Now, in addition to types, we also have different quantities of connections that can exist in different architectures. Most of the examples I've been showing for feed-forward connections have been dense or fully connected layers, meaning that all nodes in one layer are connected to all nodes in the subsequent layer. But the alternative is to have sparse connections, where only some nodes in a given layer are connected to only some nodes in the subsequent layer. Those are all the different types of connections. And when we combine connections and nodes, we get all sorts of different frameworks that exist with some predefined configurations. We've talked about perceptrons and feed-forward neural networks, but there's many other that have all sorts of different configurations. We'll be covering a few of these that I've highlighted here, such as the autoencoder, attention network, and recurrent neural network. Activation functions are another key part of neural networks. They're how nonlinearity is introduced into the predictions. And that's because activation functions are essentially just nonlinear transformations of the data. If we'll remember back to our perceptron, which had a step function that transformed the data going to the output, this step function can be substituted for any number of activation functions. Some of the more popular ones include ReLU and leaky ReLU. These two just either set all negative values to 0 and then use an identity function for positive values, or leaky ReLU, which just has a small slope for negative values. Other popular options include sigmoid and tan functions, but there's many other options for many different problems. Most of the parameters that we've been talking about already are types of hyperparameters, or things that we need to determine when designing the network architecture. And so the next set of things are concerned with the training process directly. And so when I say training, all I mean is the process of improving prediction accuracies by updating model weights in order to minimize the difference between predictions and observations. This difference between predictions and observations is also called the loss value. And we'll look at how that's calculated through a loss function, and then optimized through a loss optimization algorithm, and finally translated through the whole network through backpropagation. So the loss function, as I mentioned, determines the loss value, which is just a comparison between the observed output and the predicted output. At the simplest form, this is some type of subtraction between our observed output y and our predicted output y hat. Some examples that you might recognize from linear regression are mean squared error or mean absolute error. But again, there's many different variants that are suited to different regression tasks, and also some that are suited to classification tasks. So the process of improving the weights is accomplished through optimizing that loss value in order to find the minimum value possible for your data set and your model. And so I've included an example of what's called a loss gradient. And all that is the space of all potential weights that exist in a model. And this space must be searched through by the model in order to find the weights that minimize the loss value. And so an example of how a neural network accomplishes this by something more informed than just random initialization of weights is something called gradient descent. And we'll go through an example, but first, this 3D plot is just a depiction of actually still a really simple neural network that has perhaps just 2 weights. And the weights are on the horizontal axis and the loss value is on the vertical axis. And because weights are initialized at random values, the first loss value could be at any location on this gradient. And in order to estimate where the minimum is, we need some type of informed search method, which is gradient descent. We're going to look at an even simpler example, and you might think this is too simple at first, but it improves some of the calculations we have to do down the road, so bear with me. Let's refer back to our perceptron, and in this case, just use one X value and one corresponding weight, X and W. And so there's no need for any summation. It's just an X times W and then applying an activation function. We're also going to simplify the activation function and just call it an identity function so we can ignore this component for now. And therefore, because of those simplifications, this process just ends up being X times W. And in order to, an X times W, so our X5 and W2 generates a Y hat of 10. And let's define our observed value, Y equals 2. We can use mean squared error to calculate our loss. So that ends up being 64. We can also substitute our original parameters into this loss function and redefine it as Y minus X times W squared, which will be important in a minute. So in order to start estimating our two-dimensional loss gradient, we can first plot our initial random W value of 2 and our initial loss value of 64 and place our point. And if you guys remember your calculus, how we find the minimum of functions is doing derivatives. And so if we remember our cost function, we can substitute back in our known Y and X values, 2 and 5, and generate this function, which we've defined as parameter L. And in order to minimize L, we take the derivative with respect to W, and we generate a function that's 10 times 2 minus 5W. We can substitute in our initial W value in order to find the slope of this point, even though we don't know what the loss gradient looks like yet. And the result of that is a positive 80. And I say positive because the direction or the positive determines the direction of that slope, which is here in the positive direction. And therefore, we know we need to move to a smaller W in order to try to search and find the minimum loss value. The slope value of 80 also determines how large or small of a step we can take through this search space. And since 80 is, a fairly large number, we could probably take a pretty big step. We then repeat this process of informed search until we find the global minimum, which in this case, in this very simple example, happens to be 0. But we would take progressively smaller steps as that slope decreases. And again, this seems like a very simple example, but this is only considering one weight value. When we try to scale loss optimization to thousands or millions of weight, such as is in the case in modern neural networks, we have to use a process called backpropagation. And backpropagation is, again, based in calculus. It relies on the chain rule in order to calculate partial derivatives at each node, starting at the node closest to the output layer, and then moving through each derivative as we get closer to the input layer. And that allows us to search, do a non-random search through this loss gradient space. So we talked about learning processes, but we also need to talk about types of learning. Most of the examples that we've been covered, especially in the loss section, are examples of supervised learning. These types of learning rely on annotated data, where essentially a human has provided the system an answer and provides sort of a supervision, which is where the method gets its name. Essentially, the data labels are observed based on input data, and that is how the model learns. In contrast, in unsupervised learning method, we are generally using some type of unannotated data. And in this case, the neural network or the full system generates its own answer in order to supervise its own work. And this is often done through some type of method, such as cluster analysis or some type of dimensionality reduction for unsupervised learning. So those were some of the very quick basics of neural networks. Next, we're going to get into some specific architectures. We're going to cover some specific ones highlighted in the red: multi-layer perceptrons, recurrent neural networks, convolutional neural networks, and transformers. We'll also cover a few larger categories of architectures in the black, such as encoding, decoding type networks and ensembles. So to start off with multi-layer perceptrons, these are fully connected, feed-forward, deep, non-linear activation function types of networks. This is kind of the standard type of network that we see in a lot of examples of basic neural networks. Multi-layer perceptrons have the advantage over linear methods that their activation functions allows the incorporation of nonlinear relationships to be learned from the data. They're also one of the earlier types of modern neural networks. And so they've already been used for a wide variety of tasks and for a wide variety of data types. And so it's pretty easy to find examples of how to accomplish tasks with this type of system. A disadvantage of multi-layer perceptrons are that they're comparatively simplistic in contrast to subsequent neural network architectures. And so they're not necessarily optimally suited for all types of input data, specifically things with structure like images or time series data. Those types of data can be better suited to other network types. Now, getting into examples of how AI has been used for crop improvement tasks, MLP has been used at a fairly large scale for genomics, has been tested at a fairly large scale for genomic selection. Unfortunately, many of these methods have failed to outperform traditional methods such as BLUP and Bayesian methods. A number of publications saw results that were highly similar to these traditional methods. A couple saw results that were better, but many more also saw that there was a lot of data dependency on the performance of this neural network for genomic selection. An example of how this type of network could be used for genomic selection is shown on the right. Our inputs would be our SNP data, and the outputs would be your trait or phenotype of interest. And so unfortunately, because of the kind of mixed success of this model, and because of its increased computational complexity compared to traditional methods, it hasn't really caught on for use in genomic selection. Multi-layer perceptrons have also been used for enviromic tasks, and all I mean by enviromics or envirotyping is anything within the process of collecting, processing, and associating environmental data. MLPs have been successful for interpolating environmental data. Their nonlinear capabilities are suited to this task for reconstructing potentially variable environmental gradients. An example of a 2022 publication that used this to generate a gradient for predicted gradient for temperature is shown on the slide, and it achieved pretty high prediction accuracies. Interpolating environmental data can be particularly useful for reconstructing missing data points. It can also be useful for increasing data resolution, which especially might be a problem with something like historical weather data. The next network type that we're going to cover are encoding decoding networks. This, again, is a kind of larger parent category of network. And the general structure for an encoding decoding network are two modules, an encoding module and a decoding module, as the name suggests. The goal of the encoding module is to take a high dimensional input and reduce it down to a smaller representation. The decoder then does the reciprocal task of reconstructing the representation back out to the output dimensions. And this is good for tasks where we're doing something like converting between data types, between the input and output. Something like generating a caption for an image might use an encoding decoding type of network, but it can be used for many types of problems. Some specific neural network types that almost always use encoding decoding network structures are recurrent neural networks, autoencoders, and their variational autoencoders, and transformers. Other network types can also implement an encoding decoding type of structure, but it's not necessarily standard for some of those methods. The next type of neural network, which can be used in an encoding decoding structure, but often is not used in an encoding decoding structure, are convolutional neural networks. These types of networks are defined by some key features. Specifically, they use 3 distinct layer types. The first of which is its namesake, the convolutional layer. The goal of convolutional layers is feature selection. This is accomplished as shown in the first segment of the figure, where a filter of weight values is applied to the input data. In this case, the input data is something like the red, green, and blue channels of an image, and then the numbers or the pixel values. And this filter is multiplied by the input, and it slides across the input value or the input data set in order to generate the feature map. The feature map is generated by that multiplication and then the summation of the values generated. The next type of layer is the pooling layer, which is concerned with dimensionality reduction. And in this example, our pooling layer has a 2 by 2 dimension shown here in the cyan, yellow, and magenta colors. And all this is doing, because it's using max pooling, is taking the maximum value from that patch of the feature map and preserving it through to the output of the pooling layer. Convolutional and pooling layers are repeated a given number of times depending on the architecture until we come to the final layer, which is often a feed-forward layer. Feed-forward's goal is prediction, and it's identical to the other types of feed-forward layers that we've seen in the past. Some advantages of convolutional neural networks are that they use sparse connections, and that reduces some of the computational cost of this method compared to other neural network methods. Another advantage is that they consider that implicit spatial structure in image and other data types. Specifically in image, the relationship between the position of the pixels in the input data set is equivalent to their physical position that we would expect. However, that implicit data structure also has a limitation in that it has low flexibility when we come to structures or data that have irregular data structures. Now, it would be amiss to talk about CNNs and their use for imaging without also talking about computer vision. Historically, computer vision had a large number of processes that were each accomplished through different methods. The computer vision pipeline would look something like image acquisition and then pre-processing, segmentation, feature extraction and selection, and finally a classification or regression step. However, with neural network-based computer vision, all of these steps can kind of be rolled into a single neural network, such as a convolutional neural network, which greatly simplifies the process of using this type of computer vision system. An example from Iowa State of using CNNs for root phenomics is the 2022 Folk et al. Publication that developed the automated root imaging analysis 2.0 system. This publication utilized a convolutional autoencoder, which just means a convolutional neural network that uses that encoding, decoding type of structure. This system was developed for characterizing soybean root phenotypes. And this is a great example of that encoding, decoding kind of structure. We see that at the input layer, we have a pixel size of 256 by 256. And then as we proceed towards the center of the network, we get down to a reduced representation at 64 by 64. And then in the decoding layers, it's reconstructed back out to that 256 by 256 resolution. And we can see that the system achieved pretty good segmentation in comparison to the original, the observed segmented label. Another example from Iowa State is the use of CNNs for leaf phenotyping. This was a 2023 publication by Shang et al. It was the AngleNet system, which did maze leaf angle key point detection. It also used CNN layers in a encoding, decoding type of structure. And by key point detection, all I mean is it was identifying the midpoint of the leaf, the midpoint of the stalk, and then the hinge point in order to evaluate the angle on that specific leaf. CNNs have been also used for crop improvement tasks unrelated to phenotyping, such as regulatory genomics. A 2019 publication by Washburn et al. utilized a CNN to predict mRNA expression levels from a DNA promoter and terminator region sequences. Sequencing data is another example of a data type that has implicit structure that could be well utilized by a CNN, since adjacent nucleotides in the input data correspond to adjacent nucleotides in the physical sequence. Finally, CNNs have also been used for genomic selection. They've had similarly mixed success, have had mixed success similarly to multi-layer perceptrons, and they haven't really exceeded the performance of traditional methods in order to justify their increased complexity. There's also been some question as to the appropriateness of using CNN structures for SNP data, since they don't have since they have an irregular data structure, meaning that SNPs adjacent to each other in the data set may have varying degrees of space between them in the genome. The next network type is recurrent neural networks. These are characterized by feedback and or self-connections, which these types of connections make them capable of short-term memory. This example uses a self-connection, which can in fact be unrolled across time. And in this example, input at time t1 generates a hidden state, and that hidden state is then passed to the next hidden state of time point t, and so on, which is what they mean by short-term memory in this system. RNNs are good for time series data because of that memory. However, when we try to do training, we have to then backpropagate through time, which can become a very difficult task, especially with high dimensional data sets. RNNs have also been used for root phenomics. An example is a system called ChronoRoot, which use a ResNet model for segmentation of leaf images. All that ResNet is a CNN that uses both residual, the res, and then skip connections, the U, in their architecture. This publication found that the residual connections were pretty effective at segmenting the tubular structures of plant roots. The RNNs that I just talked about are actually first order RNNs. They just use recurrent connections. There's also a type of RNN called second order RNNs, which were subsequently developed in order to combat some of the limitations of backpropagating through time. Two examples are long short-term memory and gated recurrent units. The only thing we really need to know from these is if we look at the LSTM block, it features something called a forget gate, and that allows us to truncate the training process through time so we don't have to backpropagate all the way back to the first time step. LSTMs have been used for yield prediction. Another example from Iowa State from 2021, Shook et al. Used an LSTM to encode weekly weather data for soybean yield prediction. We can see in the image that there's LSTM blocks that have been unrolled again across time in order to generate a encoding in the blue, which is then passed to a subsequent network to predict yield. Natural language processing is another field within AI, similar to computer vision, except natural language processing is interested in all things language, whether it's comprehension or response to language, and it encompasses all types of AI that use any sort of reading or writing. And there might not be a lot of applications for this necessarily in crop improvement, but I think we should care about this field because many landmark AI advances have been made either in computer vision or natural language processing. And oftentimes these novel methods can then be adapted to tasks that are specific to crop improvement. A really good example of how NLP processes have been adapted to biological programs is the transformer, which was originally developed in 2017 for NLP tasks. And it is the basis of the ever popular ChatGPT. But a really good example of how it was adapted is AlphaFold. The first AlphaFold version was actually based on convolutional neural networks, and it was still a very successful protein folding prediction program. However, when they came to do AlphaFold, the second version of AlphaFold, they completely redesigned it and based it on the transformer. And this version of AlphaFold proved to be even more successful than the first. And this is a great example of how we can adapt methods from other fields to more relevant tasks. So to talk about the transformer specifically, it has some key characteristics that are a little different than some of the other network architectures that we've looked at. Specifically, it has positional encoding and attention. And the basics of what those two things are that positional encoding is a supplemental input vector that explicitly provides data order. This, in some cases, solves some of the problems certain data types have with using convolutional neural networks. But the really important thing that this is used for is increased parallelization of training. Because order is explicitly defined, we don't have to feed information into train information in the order that it is represented. In recurrent neural networks, we have to show the first data first to the network during training and the last data last for time series data. In a transformer, this doesn't need to happen. You can show the data in any type of order that you want, since positions are explicitly defined. Attention is the second key feature. Attention is important as a difference from other types because it essentially learns interactions between values in the input vector, meaning that there is a weight matrix that tells the network how important one input is for the context of another input. To make this a little clearer, if we think about natural language processing examples, we might know for something like text generation, in order to do next word prediction of a verb, the noun might be really important in that sentence, but other words may be less important for predicting that given word. And so looking specifically at the structure, we covered positional encoding and attention in the purple. Some other layer types are addition and normalization. That's really straightforward. It does exactly what the name suggests. It's adding different values and then normalizing them. The feed-forward layer in the yellow is, again, identical to other feed-forward layers we've looked at. Transformers are also another type of encoding decoding type of network. The encoding is highlighted here in the gray, and the decoding is shown in the white. Some advantages of transformers are that because of attention and positional encoding, they have increased flexibility compared to some other methods. The positional encoding also, like I mentioned, makes it highly parallelizable, which increases training efficiencies. Some disadvantages of transformers are that they contain a truly extreme number of parameters compared to many other methods. Training a transformer is impossible on a personal computer and sometimes even difficult on high-performance computing clusters. Another disadvantage is that transformers can sometimes do something called hallucinations. If you've ever used something like ChatGPT and it outputs an intelligible sentence or paragraph, but then you actually read it and it's like, this stuff is all just made up and not true. That's an example of a hallucination. And those are some things that are being worked on as we go forward with this architecture, but there are also things that are important to keep in mind. Transformers have only been out since 2017, so there's less examples for this type of architecture. They have, however, been used for genomic selection. Specifically, in a 2021 publication, they were used for disease resistance genomic selection in wheat. For genomic selection, we only use the encoding half of the transformer, which is its own architecture within the transformer family called BERT, which stands for bidirectional encoding representations from transformers. This publication also notably used an alternative SNP encoding scheme instead of the allele counts, which are often used. They used Hardy-Weinberg frequency-based encodings. Unfortunately, again, this type of genomic selection achieved results that were pretty similar compared to traditional methods. The final type of neural network is ensembles, and actually ensembles can be extended to any type of machine learning. And we've in fact already seen one type of ensemble in the random forest example. We saw a collection of decision trees to create a new model type, and ensembles can use any type of model as their submodel. And they can either be all the same type of submodel, or they can be different types of submodels, such as something like an ensemble with a linear regression, a multi-layer perceptron, and a convolutional neural network. Those examples that we just looked at, however, all used either averaging or majority voting, but ensembles can also be fused with something called intermediate fusion when there's an additional submodel that connects all of the different submodels and provides some additional learned parameters to calculate the output. This becomes particularly applicable when we want to use an ensemble with different data types. For instance, if our input 3 in the yellow was something like image data, we might want to use a CNN for that purpose. We can also have something called early fusion models, but generally these are just dimensionality reduction methods and not as relevant to the discussion of ensembles. And so because there's such a wide variety and range of ensemble methods, obviously the training strategies and training data sampling approaches also can really vary. One example specifically for neural networks is multimodal neural networks. Like we were just discussing, ensembles can use multiple types of data or multiple modes of data. Some characteristics of these MNNs are that they generally use intermediate fusion, and they also generally have, they can also have the same or different subnetwork types similarly to other ensembles. The advantage of using MNNs are potentially increased accuracies compared to their individual submodels because you're considering all of the data together. However, obviously with combining all of these submodels, we're generating an increasing complex model type. A couple examples from crop improvement is first an MCNN for UAV phenomics. This multimodal CNN was used for maize phenotype predictions from a 2023 publication. This utilized the modes of data such as multispectral and LiDAR UAV data in order to predict a number of different phenotypes. The two examples here are dry grain yield and total plant nitrogen content. Another example of an MNN is for yield prediction. This was a 2023 publication from Kick et al. In this case, it was a multimodal neural network utilizing different network types for 3 different types of data in order to predict yield. It utilized both genomic, soil, and weather and management data with MLP and CNN subnetworks, and it utilized intermediate fusion through this interaction subnetwork. And so those are all of the different types that we were going to cover. And it would be kind of a miss to be discussing AI and neural networks without also mentioning interpretability. Like I alluded to in the machine learning section, neural networks or many types of AI have poor inference capability, but neural networks specifically are generally considered to be black box types models, meaning inference is next to impossible with these types of methods. Another important concern because of the lack of inference capability is that neural networks attempt to learn very efficiently and therefore can sometimes learn superficial correlations between the data instead of what we would expect in causal correlations between the data in order to make their predictions. And when that happens, it's called shortcut learning, and it can lead to poor model transferability outside of your training data. And again, this is a concern because the black box model makes it hard to identify when this happens. So we've heard a lot of information, and just to kind of wrap it up, we have described that AI has changed rapidly since its inception, or greatly since its inception and rapidly in the last decade. AI has also been shown to be a useful tool for crop improvement tasks related to phenomics, genomics, environmics, and other multi-omic data types. Overall, I think the future for using AI for crop improvement is bright. It's a lens that we can use to develop new methods that can be better suited to the also rapidly evolving field of crop improvement. Finally, I'd like to thank the collaborators on our recently published review article. Dr. Lee from the USDA ARS and Dr. Welsh from Kansas State University were tremendous co-authors. I'd also like to thank Dr. Yu for giving me the opportunity to learn as I wrote and really develop my knowledge base of AI. And finally, I'd like to thank lab members for putting up with a lot of AI discussions. And finally, I'd like to thank funding sources for supporting this work. At this time, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or discussion points. Thank you. Yes.
Great. I was just curious. So you explained the winters and the summers of AI. What would you say was, like, you kind of gave the cause, but what was the reasoning to overcome those, like those winters, and like kind of how does that look in the future?
Yeah. I know the winters had pretty defined turning points. I think the initiation of the summers in some cases did for the first AI summer, the turning point was really that summer workshop in 1956, where a lot of these minds of early AI got together and started developing some methods. For the second summer, expert systems gained some really high popularity in like the commercial sector. Like businesses were developing them to take over tasks that previously could only be accomplished by human experts. And for the third AI summer, there is a pretty defined moment. I think the development and publication of the AlexNet CNN for computer vision tasks, it had really much more increased prediction accuracies than previous approaches to computer vision. And that kind of kickstarted, I think, the third AI summer.
What about
Yeah, technology was also a big limitation for much of the first AI summers and winters. Computational capacity really started to develop in the early 2000s. And then with the development of GPUs in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that drove a lot of these different types of neural networks being developed. So technology was definitely a limitation for early years and then an advantage in recent years. I would say we're kind of back to like a computer bottleneck. A lot of the really large models like transformers and other variant models that have been subsequently developed, only places like Google or Microsoft or whoever, they're the only ones that have the computational capacity in order to train these models. And so there's some discussion in the community as to how we can kind of like bring it back down to a level where especially like research institutions and like non-businesses can become competitive again in the AI like development game. Yes.
Here you put several examples from obvious application and that the AI message similarly. What do you think of reason?
Yeah, specifically, are you asking specifically for genomic selection? Yeah. And so genomic selection, especially the traditional methods, and this is kind of just my opinion, a lot of the traditional methods were really intentionally designed and were developed over a course of a great number of years in order to achieve the prediction accuracies that we're seeing today and in recent years. In contrast, a lot of the AI approaches to genomic selection are just kind of, this model works in this other field, let's directly use it for genomic selection tasks. And not a lot of like intentional redesign is being done for these systems. I think that's a component of it. Other components are just, it's a pretty complex task. And I think just the time hasn't been spent on it. that in comparison to other fields and other genomic selection approaches. Yes.
First, wonderful job synthesizing all of this.
Thank you.
Especially from a literature that uses all these terms in very, they've used the term, clear definitions, they slide them around.
Mm-hmm.
First, we came across anything about kind of minimum training sets. I mean, certainly like, ChatGPT is only possible because it can mine entirely.
Yeah, especially as we're moving towards larger and larger AI models, that is becoming a bigger concern. That also might be part of the reason why genomic selection hasn't really been solved by modern AI methods yet. There's like obviously not just like a certain number that's appropriate, but I think especially for some small, like comparatively small scale crop improvement tasks, we're definitely hitting kind of a new data bottleneck for large AI methods. And I think it will definitely be, data size will definitely become more of a concern as the models continue to increase in size.
If I ask questions, you're not supposed to have just three questions today. The people in the back are experts in some discussion points.
Awesome job, Karlene, with your presentation.
Thank you.
My question to you is, do you think interpretability is important or accuracy is important for the model?
I think it depends on who you ask. Obviously, I think for a lot of crop improvement tasks, it's sometimes worth it to sacrifice interpretability for accuracy in terms of developing it as a tool for people to use. I think for like fundamental biological science stuff, it's not as applicable unless you generate some methods that have some type of interpretability embedded in it. I definitely think we're seeing a larger and larger division between statistics and AI as we move towards these almost completely black box neural network models. Yes.
In the group phenotyping, the encoding decoding process, I'm not sure if I follow. You said you start with a lot of pixels, and that encoding process reduce the amount of pixels and then increase the number of pixels again. What is the purpose of the encoding decoding system? Or
I don't have all the details on that specific publication. If anybody else knows more than me, feel free to jump in. But just kind of generally the encoding decoding process. In that instance, I know it was being used for like segmentation of the image or to define like where the root like boundaries are on that image. I would assume it would be kind of like because encoding decoding networks can also be used in the context of like decreasing noise within a data set. And it might be something along those lines. Like identifying the like pixels that are definitely like root and not like fuzziness in the image. That might not be the case, but yes. No, yep, it is from the.
Some of the things we see this before, and then we got.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Was that this one you were asking, right? Yeah. Can you follow up that question? Can you actually also talk about, there's a word called representation, and there's a pattern, there's features, extraction, feature selection. Can you combine them to tell what we're doing when we do refinement or refinement of EI?
In a lot of cases, AI methods are doing things like, well, I'll go to the CNN example. In a lot of cases, these things like feature maps, which other types of neural network are also identifying quote unquote features in the data. They're just not quite doing it in this like matrix structure. Essentially, it's trying to learn, especially in computer vision, like where are the lines between colors? Where are the regions that are all part of the same object? Those types of things would all be considered filters. A really good example, especially for CNNs and computer vision, is something like handwriting analysis. Letters are pretty simple structures. If you're looking for the letter I, you might have a feature map that's just a straight up and down line, and then another feature map that's like a dot with white space around it. And those would be the things that would be identified using this filter. It would be pretty straightforward with that example. A straight line, you would just have high weight values down the middle of this, and then zeros through the edges to indicate non-important area or white space in that image. And this kind of idea can be scaled up to many different types of CNN problems and also other types of neural networks in terms of finding those things that are characteristic in the data that tell us what kind of prediction, or tell the network that what kind of prediction or classification it should be making. Does that answer your question? Yes.
I have a question. The pooling layer says max pooling, and obviously it's taking from like a max value from each 2 by 2 squared.
Yep.
Are there other methodologies of pooling, like minimum, average?
Yes. Those are max pooling is pretty popular, but I don't know what the exact ranking is, but the next things to mention would definitely be average pooling and minimum pooling. Yep. It's just any type of method that can kind of compress those regions of importance that were identified in the feature map.
I remember seeing some of the slides from that Lisa or some of the groups that like this was always from Kevin Ford on this one. I'm asking you guys, who actually showed the similar?
So we have shown a lot of review papers how.
But I was asking this one about students.
Oh, okay.
You had, I remember that one of you had shown the presentation earlier, similar processing. Was that you, right? You show a similar, okay, different. We've seen something before. I mean, I think earlier presentation by Ari many years ago. Yeah. So this takes so much time to remember. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a question over here?
Yeah, when I saw this one, I was imagining like all the data that you get in the field, and if, to your knowledge, someone has used this artificial intelligence method to do selections of breeding, like based on like
phenotype?
select comparing all those layers and giving you like, oh yeah, this is the genotype to select.
Yeah, like a lot of those people have, I mentioned genomic selection methods, and even within some of those methods that I mentioned, people are incorporating genomic and other data. Some people do phenomic selection. I don't know off the top of my head any examples of using AI to do it, but I would assume since image-based phenotyping is really successful, there probably are some instances. I'm not aware of them at the moment. Yes.
Oh, I got a question about economics. You mentioned that it's regulated.
I don't know of any work, because even the transformer genomic selection method didn't actually employ the positional encoding of transformers. And so I'm trying to think, the point that I made about CNNs not being potentially not being a relevant method for genomic selection did provide some alternatives that didn't necessarily like encode the position information, but they used a kind of a different scheme with their filter, where they essentially had more filters than just one. And so they would be like locally, there'd be a filter for the upper right portion, a filter for the upper left portion, and so on and so forth. But it didn't really explicitly consider structure. And in fact, doing a local convolution is actually kind of approximating an MLP system. And so the purpose is kind of, I don't know if that's relevant either. I don't know of any examples that encode that information explicitly.
Ashley, we were asking that because, you know, SNP 1, 2, 3, their different are different, right? You know, how would that, if you have different SNP density at a different part of the genome, but then only to detect that is to stop taking the data to see if you know, keep some SNPs unobserved, see that affect your process, right? That's a interesting question. Even when Karlene is doing some genome collection, consider the genome, you know, the physical location of the SNPs.
Yep.
But then still, we're not sure how to handle that because the SNP just pop up in some places for less than in other places, right? Would that also need to be considered? That's a question. Yeah. Unless you unify with genetic reasons, then you might thinking that some, you know, genetic, you know, simply modern distance can be somewhat unified, and then when you have not SNP there or, you know, the other place, that was a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very quick presentation. I was wondering if, because you show several examples of different neural networks used for genomic selection. So which one of them you can have higher potential for the further applications that we have on the field, or if all of them?
Yeah, I think unless some serious adaptations are made to some of the kind of more historical types of neural networks, I don't know if those are, I don't know if in their current state they would be useful for genomic selection. I think, as I was mentioning in the NLP section, we always need to be paying attention to new methods being developed in other fields that can potentially be adapted for use for like genomic selection or other tasks. I think transformers haven't been investigated to their full potential. Yet I think incorporating that positional information, the physical position information of SNPs into the positional encoding could be interesting. And attention might also be applicable for SNP data sets because of like genetic interactions and so forth. But I think we really need to be doing some intentional design with these methods when it comes to adapting them from other fields. Yes.
So if we were to pick one to really design and adapt it to take a year or scale,
I would like to use transformers just because they're the current state of the art, and so they've been the least investigated. Unfortunately, like we were discussing with like data limitations, compared to people training these models for language tasks, we have very small data sets in some type of aggregated condition. I think that might be one of the serious limitations of employing like extremely large models like transformers for tasks like genomic selection.
You show one of the two slides where you show the, you know, Jonathan Shook had a publication about this RNN, and then from Joshua, you know, Jacob Washbone's group.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we will have Jacob Washbone and then Hicks to be coming to later in the semester to talk about you know, machine learning neural network mix with this prediction. Yeah. So here, compare this one, you know, versus the other study where you have multimodal solo. You can click to the other one again.
Yeah.
Yes. This is the newest publication from Jacob Washbone. This is the last name, yeah.
Yeah, Daniel Hick.
Yeah. And then the postdoc is these are from Missouri. Was this because their data sources are different? Earlier, Jonathan Cook versus this one, or there's like, you know, I remember there was a time series data of the weather, and you comment on the data overlapping or data structure, and why the design is something different?
Yeah. First thing was the Shook et al. Was using soybean data, and this was using the G2F maize data, and so the data types are different. I'm not sure where whether data was obtained with either of these studies. Probably some type of public database. Specifically, like in this case, a CNN was used for the weather and management data. And in the other case, it was a type of recurrent neural network, the LSTM. And so CNNs are also sometimes used for time series data, but they do handle it differently, like I explained in the CNN and recurrent neural network slides. I'm trying to remember this. This is considered to be a multimodal neural network. I think the other one would probably also be considered a multimodal neural network, but since it was using LSTMs, which recurrent neural networks aren't particularly popular, haven't been like as popular as some of the other methods for crop improvement tasks. So I was happy to find an example of somebody doing that, especially from Iowa State. But yeah.
There, what did Jonathan do? I remember he scanned the writing file and put it in the database. And so do you have the data, the yield data, writing file? Do you have soil data too, or just weather data?
It was just weather data, and then with that, soil data could potentially be gathered from Sergo if you want.
That work did not, include any genomics, like a little writing files.
No, it's historic data and a lot of
yes.
There's no public data you can get for it.
And I think maybe, which I could be wrong, but one of the key things, at least from this figure, I don't know if necessarily these two networks are connected via training. They very well might be, but that would probably differentiate it from some other types of ensemble that have like a unified training system, which that may or may not be the case.
Yeah, on the left side, he did have have clusters, maturity groups, but not genomic data, phenotyping data, right? And then the weather, we say soil.
I don't know about soil data.
And sometimes, the methodology changing based on what type of data you have, so that's the progression of this area. Yeah. All this presentation, the people will hear for long, we saw the studies 30 years, right? And sometimes you have to bring it together, especially even some newer students in the same group, you have to grasp what people did earlier. Yeah. Other questions? To keep you for long? Okay, let's hear Karlene.